Hello and welcome to another Perspectives. And in the last one, which was the first one of 2024, I looked at the notion of being unpredictable, predictive programming, and how complex social systems have their own inbuilt uh, aspects and features and unpredictable tipping points. And after I made that perspectives, I began to think about my own background in complex systems, um, because my PhD was called New Complexities, that I completed in 2006. And before that, my MA was called, um, which I wrote in 2003, completed 2002, completed 2003, was called An Evolutionary Paradigm of Social Systems, where I was looking at evolutionary systems philosophy, and I put it into the internet and looked at how the internet as a technology was going through a kind of metaphorical evolutionary systems development. So I really actually that has underpinned a lot of what I've been researching and writing about since then, looking at the physical world through the lens of complex systems. And also, during my PhD, my doctorate, there was a part of my doctorate where I wanted to look at the kind of shadow side of complex systems, how certain processes, such as large corporations and the military, were looking through the lens of complexity to try to socially manage and get a control over the systems. And um, you see, that's a kind of feature of complex systems, is that the more complex they become, the more energy you have to put into as kind of trying to control that complexity. And we see that in civilizations like the Roman Empire. As it grew, it had to put outposts of Roman outposts in other countries. And these people would take the taxes and try to quell unrest in those regions. And of course, sometimes those Romans in those regions would even start to try and usurp power for themselves against centralized Rome because they were so far away. They thought, they'd get away with it. And of course, and eventually Rome expanded so much, and there was revolt on the perimeters and of the empire because of the taxes. And when the Visigoths came in and the raiders, centralized Rome couldn't organize um, a, a strong enough response. And so, you know, like all complex systems, the uh, the change or the anomalies coming from the periphery and eventually collapse the center. It's very unusual for the center to collapse first. So, and I think we're seeing that in the same model of all empires. And look at the US today, that it now has military outposts in hundreds of countries around the world to try to maintain its dominance. But of course, you need to feed that with resources and energy and information. And what they're seeing now, of course, is certain areas of the periphery of the empire being contested by other forces, other geopolitical forces. And of course, the center is in the US, but they are so far away from other peripheries. So that also made me think of a theory which is being quite spoken about in the last few years online. And this is the kind of, it's called the Moloch Game theory or the Moloch hypothesis. The name Moloch refers to an ancient Canaanite god, and it's mentioned in the Torah and the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. And the Canaanites had this god which some people worshipped and sacrificed children to, in terms of, and in return they wanted power and to gain, to win. So Moloch has a very dark energy around it. And so recently people have been talking about the Moloch game theory. Now, in normal game theory, you try to look for a win-win solution. But the Moloch game theory is the reverse, where it's the lose-lose outcome. Everybody loses eventually, but of course they lose because they're focusing on short-term gains. And this Moloch theory, we can see it again happening in our civilizations now. One example would be nuclear weapons. Now, if one country is developing a nuclear weapons, which is dangerous enough in itself, why do other countries develop them? Because, you know, they they don't want to be under the threat of nuclear weapons. So they'll say, well, they're developing them, we must develop them to maintain the balance. Because of course, no one wants the MAD outcome, MAD, mutually assured destruction. So if enough people have nuclear weapons, the idea is nobody's going to use them. Why would you use it against your enemy if they can use it against you? So everybody has to join the race in order to keep the kind of dynamic balance. Now, but that's a short-term goal. But in the long term, it's disastrous because now we have a world of nuclear weapons and etc. and nuclear proliferation. Another one which is being talked about right now is the different arms race. It's the AI arms race, the militarization of AI. Because one major power like America will say, well, we have to race to develop AI, because if we don't, another country, another nation state, such as China or Russia, will create AI first, and whoever gets there first has an advantage. If we don't have AI, then we can be conquered. So we must develop AI too. So there's a race for the militarization and the weaponization of AI because, well, they're doing it, we have to do it. That's known as the Moloch lose-lose game theory, because the short-term competition forces everybody into this race. But of course, in the long term, it's not going to serve beneficial ends. And where do we go from there? What's the next advantage? So one team, whether it's a group or a country, will develop something. And of course, everyone else has to develop likewise in that competition race to not lose out. But in the end, everybody loses out. What's going to be the future of a militarized, weaponized AI? Of course, so this is a kind of self-defeating game theory called Moloch. And I think it's an appropriate name, being the god of human sacrifice. Now, I'm saying that because complex systems also can tempt players into this Moloch theory, because when a system grows in complexity, there's the temptation to say, well, in order, we could let it to be self-organizing. Self-organizing systems are in nature, are basically operative on all different levels: cosmic levels, physical levels, chemical levels, biological levels, self-organizing systems. But of course, in a societal context, social cultural systems, there's a tendency to be wary of self-organizing aspects, because where's the control? How do you control the outcome? Social management is a strong aspect of our cultures. So the more complex a society comes, the more temptation it is to gain advantage over controlling those complex aspects and its potential outcomes. And then it becomes a race, because, as you become more complex, you become more controlled. But of course, when you control things, you have the capacity to allow more control. So the system grows because you feel you have the ability to control more. And it seems like this is what's happening now with our technologies. Our technologies are complexifying our relations, our connections, our global order. And then, of course, they're also allowing a greater degree of control and management and containment over the system. And the system's then bringing in more technology to allow it more control, and the technology then expands the system. So it's a kind of Moloch kind of situation. And although the term Moloch theory is very recent, during my PhD thesis, I was looking at this use of complex systems for containment and control. And, and I couldn't publish that because in academic university journals, it's very strict where you publish. So I started to publish online, and that was part of my process of moving away from the academic environment, I started to publish online. And I went back and I found actually an article that I did publish way back in 2008. And some of it's extracted from my thesis from years earlier, and some was added to it and researched around 2007. So this is an article I was writing in 2007. It was published online, which is now quite a well-known site for alternative academic material called Global Research. And I looked back at it and I thought, well, this is quite prescient, perhaps, since it was written prior to 2008 and published 2008. I'll put the link below to the essay. I'd like to go through this essay and share it with you here because I think it could have some relevant pointers to what we're seeing today. The essay was and is called Global Gridlock: How the US military-industrial complex seeks to contain and control the Earth and its ecosystem. So I was looking at how technologies were being used by the US military-industrial complex, specifically at the time, the US, to not only look at contained social cultural systems, but also environmental ones. And I started the essay by giving the analogy of a story by the Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges. And Borges had this story whereby he wrote of a great empire which created a map to show its empire. And in fact, the map was so large, it was as large as the empire itself. And as the empire grew, so did the map to represent it. And also, as the empire decayed and lost territory, the map would show that. Finally, the empire decayed, and what was left was just a map. The map remained. And that's a nice symbolic story because you know, there's the phrase, the map is not the territory. The simulacra, the simulation is not the real. So we had the simulation of the empire through the map, but the empire had long gone. What was left was just the vestiges, the traces of it. So in my introduction, I gave that story, I mentioned that story, and I said, I quote, "In recent years, many of us have been scrambling to get on the net and thus be mapped. Within a few years, we may find that living off the net will no longer be an option. It is my argument that the future direction of present technological emergence is one that seeks to go beyond networks. Rather, it is towards ubiquitous technologies that offer a complete immersive, or rather submersive, experience of a digitized environment." And I finished my introduction by saying, in this article, I argue that the US military-industrial complex is attempting to gain full dominance over the complete information spectrum, including dominating the electromagnetic spectrum and the internet, in order to gain full total coverage for purposes of containment and control. So remember, this was written in 2007. So I started to look at what I called moving towards full spectrum dominance, because full spectrum dominance was a kind of military strategy by the US Pentagon, especially after they created their Total Information Awareness Office after the 9/11 attacks. And so DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, was put in control of trying to look at how full spectrum dominance could be put into operation. And so I look at that. I look at certain elements of where the US military were looking at, and I wrote here, in 1997, the Chief of Staff of the US Air Force predicted that within 3 years, quote, "we shall be capable of finding, tracking, and targeting virtually in real time any significant element moving on the face of the Earth." So that was an Air Force Chief of Staff in 1997 predicting that. Within 3 years, we are now within 17 years. And I'm not sure if you're aware, but there was a project called the GIG, Global Information Grid. So as this move towards establishing a total system, according to the US military, I continue to write, as part of this project, the US military are currently establishing a linkage of satellites into what has been dubbed the military Internet in the Sky, which will form part of their secure informational network named as the Global Informational Grid, or GIG. This war net, as the military also term it, forms the core of the US military's move towards appropriating network-centric warfare. Now, being an academic paper, it's full of citations, so everything I say is given a citation to the research paper that it came from, so you can anyone wishing to follow that up can do so. And I talk about how this global information grid involved military contractors and also civilian contractors as well, such as Boeing, Cisco Systems, Hewlett-Packard, IBM, Lockheed Martin, Microsoft, Raytheon, Sun Microsystems, all the usual suspects. So I continue in this paper, and again, I'm reading from what I wrote. Quote, recently, a document entitled Information Operation Roadmap was declassified by the Pentagon and made public by the National Security Archive on January the 26th, 2006. According to this document, the term information operations includes, and I quote from the document, the integrated employment of the core capabilities of electronic warfare, computer network operations, psychological operations, military deception, and operations security, in concert with specified supporting and related capabilities to influence, disrupt, corrupt, or usurp adversarial human and automated decision-making while protecting our own. And I say that this document continues by outlining how the US military needs to secure a future electromagnetic capability, quote, sufficient to provide maximum control of the entire electromagnetic spectrum, denying, degrading, disrupting, or destroying the full spectrum of globally emerging communication systems, sensors, and weapon systems dependent on the electromagnetic spectrum. That's a DoD, Department of Defense, document from 2003. I quoted from page 61. I continue by saying that the Brigadier General Robert Lennox, Deputy Chief of the Army Space and Missile Defense Command at the time, describes the military vision as, quote, one seamless battlefield which is linked without the bounds of time or space to knowledge centers and deployment bases throughout the world, end quote. Beginning in 2008, the US Navy plans to replace its ultra-high frequency follow-on satellite network with a mobile user objective system, which will provide a voice and data communications through wireless handheld receivers as part of the GIG, Global Information Grid. Now, this was way back in, 20 years ago or so. And of course, we know anyone following information will know that, the Musk's Starlink satellites, there's thousands of them in orbit. They have more in orbit than the US military or any military. And so this global information grid is already there. And they wanted to follow it with monitoring voice and data communications through wireless handheld receivers. Well, what is a wireless handheld receiver? It's a smartphone now, isn't it? Back then, they weren't smartphones. They had phones, but they weren't smartphones. So wireless handheld receivers are already part of the GIG, Global Information Grid. So it was all being slowly percolating and processing, and all the elements being put in place of this complex system over the decades. And it's very clear when you go back into all the documents and data and reportage. I continue by saying, as for the new generation of surveillance satellites launched since 2005, when these systems are fully operational, the elite military complex will be able to gain precise information, not only upon alleged enemies, but also upon the movements of almost any individual upon the planet at almost any time, anywhere. So that surveillance tracking of any time, anywhere is already upon us. We know that. But this was obviously clearly in operation for decades. I continue by saying, security is both socio-technical and biometric, with the security problematic becoming increasingly virtual and codified, ordered with attempted control of disorder. The militarization of complex global open systems has serious implications for issues of civil liberty and notions of the surveillance state. These are the operations of clandestine strategies that seek to contain the unpredictable and to map all physical digital movements and traces. So it sounds like something I would write now, but I wrote it 17 years ago, and it's still, I think, indicative of what we're seeing now, is that because these open complex systems are unpredictable, those in power and control do not like that unpredictability. They want to contain it. They want to make it predictable. They want to invert it. Of course, to do that, of course, it's a militarization of these open systems. So with open systems, you can have disorder and chaos. You don't know how the elements are going to respond. That's why the potential for civil unrest and for human responses are not completely known. That's the chaotic part of an open system. But the attempt here is to contain everything through digitization. If everybody has a digital ID, which they need to use for accessing services and getting universal basic income, for example, then they are not permitted to act against the system or chaotically, because they will lose their rights of access. So therefore, the system has then contained. And that's the agenda, to create a physical containment in this realm. Of course, that does not take into account any metaphysical situations, but that's another matter. I continue by saying, such meshing of the physical and digital through the medium of sentient communicators is what is foreseen here as steering towards a digitally rendered global system vulnerable to control via a technical military elite. No wonder I couldn't get this published in an academic journal. Ex-US National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski, in his book Between Two Ages, America's Role in the Technotronic Era, published in 1970, put forward the concept of a future technotronic era, whereby a more controlled society would gradually emerge, dominated by an elite, unrestrained by traditional values. Brzezinski wrote that, quote, power will gravitate into the hands of those who control information, adding that surveillance and data mining will encourage, quote, tendencies through the next several decades towards a technocratic era, a dictatorship leaving even less room for political procedures as we know them, end quote. Now, I remember being at university and going into the library and picking up this book from 1970 by Zbigniew Brzezinski, the ex-National Security Advisor. Those people who know about global politics will know very well the influence of Brzezinski. And I remember reading this thinking, this is powerful stuff, written in 1970, talking about a technotronic era, which is here right now. And Brzezinski laid it all out. That book now is very hard to find. It goes for a very high price, several £100 and dollars. But those people who are interested may be able to find a digital version on archive.org. It is there, I've checked. This is the quote from Brzezinski from his 1970 book, a quote from page 252. Unhindered by the restraints of traditional liberal values, this elite would not hesitate to achieve its political ends by the latest modern techniques for influencing public behavior and keeping society under close surveillance and control. So that's the social, cultural side of it. Then I went on to the what I call the ecosphere. And this is the part which is called censoring the ecosphere, the coming of a synchronic society. I mentioned the French theorist Jules de Rosnay, who wrote a book called The Symbiotic Man. He was looking at symbiotic humanity. Here's a quote from his work from the year 2000, 24 years ago. Quote, each person functions as a node in this hyper-network. Symbiotic humanity is both the totality of the network and one of its elements. It exists through the network, and the network exists only through it. So you see, when complex systems were coming up 25 years ago, there were already this potential that people were picking up on by saying, well, you can contain everything in complex systems. There's no outside. Everything is inclusive inside. Now imagine the potential for the power brokers that this coming technotronic era would allow everything to be in the system. And so even you had theorists talking about humanity would be symbiotic. It would not exist as individual nodes, but it would only exist as part of the hyper network. And so this also, total containment means that not only the elements in the physical Earth system, but the physical Earth itself has to be censored and monitored. And there are projects for this as well. I'll continue by saying a physical, digital, augmented environment interlinked with objects is based upon identification. Objects, as well as individuals, need to be identified, both in their object self-identity as well as in their positions. And yet this shift is not limited towards individuals or objects. It also extends into nature and the ecosystem. These updated moves towards securing a military full-spectrum dominance incorporate the latest known developments in smart sensors, whereby complex computerized devices at the miniature or even nano level will be able to 24/7 monitor ecological, social, and/or biological environments and people. So, indeed, they created projects. The DARPA created projects whereby sensors would be placed all around the Earth, under the water, of course, satellites as well, to monitor all the natural environment as well. So the natural environment is no longer natural. It's placed within the hyper network of everything. Everything becomes a node, whether it's organic or inorganic. And I said that such a scenario, if realized, would drastically alter the material and social fabric of the living world. I give a few examples of these projects. There's the Earth Scope project from the National Science Foundation. There was the National Ecological Observatory Network, NEON, which had 500 million given to it. Another one here, I said, the National Science and Technology Council within the Executive Office of the US President has recently published their strategic plan for the US Integrated Earth Observation System. I mean, it's the Earth system, but it's controlled by the US. Strategic plan for the US Integrated Earth Observation System. Their vision is to discover, access, collect, manage, archive, process, and model Earth geological data in order to better forecast such flows as weather, energy, natural resources, pre- and post-disasters, as well as a host of all other integrated processes. I note that cartography, the mapping, cartography as a pioneering navigational science and art has long been used for validating colonial expansion, imperial incursions, and for designating especially Western territorial trophies. So I finished that part by saying emergent technologies in information censoring indicate an authoritarian, predominantly military strategy for Earth monitoring. Increasingly, relationships between humans, devices, environments are being merged or steered towards a new construction of social life, one that embeds the individual as a digitally rendered identity within a global informational gridlock. If such an irreversible shift is made towards digitally rendered societies, this would arguably lock in a form of monitored control society. With such predictions of an increasingly censored and enmeshed global system, it is difficult to see how living off the net will be a choice in the near future. I'm sure that when I wrote those words in 2007, I was not envisioning where we will be today. I was envisioning the potentials if they will. But of course, to envision the potentials and to be in this threshold right now is two different things. But of course, you can see the vision very clear over the decades. And I have a page here of conclusion. And if you allow me to, I'll read my whole conclusion because I think it sums up quite well my article. In my conclusion, I say, as this article has argued, there are both overt and covert strategies within the US military-industrial complex towards securing full spectrum dominance over global information flows, which include dominating the electromagnetic spectrum and the internet. Increasingly, Western technological societies are moving towards developing censored environments whereby information is processed on individuals as well as securing geographical data. This suggests a future whereby, in order to move legitimately, an individual will be subjected to a complex network of informational tracking and verification. This will undoubtedly see an increased militarization of the civil sphere. Such a reconfiguration of the social, through increased dependency upon physical digital systems, will inevitably involve various structural relations of power. For example, individuals not deemed worthy will be denied the right of movement through digitally controlled spaces. This is not to imply that all acts of social passage will necessarily be uncomfortably noticed by the general legitimized user. It is likely that inbuilt strategies of marginalization will be increasingly normalized as part of shifting social practices, a regular state of affairs within a 21st century beset by manipulated terror insecurities. Further, there are indications that these entwined and embedded information flows will seek to incorporate not only the physical and digital, but also the biological. In other words, each unit of information will be sought to be coded and therefore secured under a full spectrum dominance agenda. Gunatilake, a professor of sociology from Sri Lanka, Gunatilake, 1999, sees this as moving towards a meta-communications environment that will merge human, genetic, cultural, machine as information codes, and which will serve as an information carrier. I now quote from Gunatilake, professor of sociology from Sri Lanka, 1999, quote, "The future will thus result in intense communications, not only between machines and humans, but also with genetic systems, so that information in the three realms of genes, culture, and machines will result in one interacting whole. The three, for all purposes, will be interacting as one communicating system." End quote. I continue by saying, we may soon be moving towards a momentous shift, perhaps the most important paradigmatic shift our current civilization has ever witnessed, a transformation into a digitally contained and controlled global environment. This leaves the future vulnerable to extreme possibilities. Already there has been much internet chatter about the potentials this offers for exotic containment and control practices, including the possibility that a space-based armed communications network is capable of beaming electromagnetic pulse technology upon virtually any chosen spot on the Earth. The potential here for mass mind control strategies is severely worrying and unnerving. As we move towards the second decade of the 21st century, we come increasingly close to a crossroads. One path indicates a move towards a deep and entrenched militarization of the civil sphere, where control and containment are the order of the day. The other path leads towards increased civil participation, engagement, and empowerment. It is perhaps a choice between global emancipation or complete global gridlock. And that was my essay, which, as you can probably now understand, was not permitted to be published in an academic journal, but it was published in Global Research Online. Now, it seems that that crossroads I mentioned, the crossroads where we could move into emancipation or global gridlock, we're on the cusp of that now. And so, you see, that's the Moloch theory in play. You have the potential of containment on the global system through technologies. And so if one party doesn't do it, it's going to be done anyway. But you see, I wrote that when I wrote that obviously when the US military-industrial complex was the dominant player. As we know now, that shifted, or perhaps always was the case, but it wasn't understood at the time, or I didn't see it at the time, that in fact the US playing partner was just a lower order player. In fact, the end goal was obviously not a US or any national military complex, but a global cabal running military-industrial complex over the world. So, of course, the end goal was for a global group to have global containment over all unpredictability. What are the unpredictabilities? Humans. Now, that's the physical perspective. Because if you have a physical system and you think and perceive through the physical lens, then you want to contain that system, of course. But we know that the physical manifestation is only one aspect. There's the metaphysical side, the interventions that come into this physical domain from outside. Now, when I said that everything is contained, there's no outside, that's only on a physical level. Of course, that famous alchemical engraving of the alchemist looking through the bubble to a different realm outside. You see, that's the way outside of the containment. The containment is within the bubble, but that's physical. Of course, we also have to remember that this notion of global containment is an artificial project. No organic, systemic body can be totally contained. So it already includes its own threads of breakdown in that. And that's why sometimes manufactured chaos is created in order to showcase the need for a response of artificial containment. But at some point, this project will collapse, and that's part of forces, evolutionary forces, developmental forces, metaphysical forces that are outside of this human hubris of artificial containment. So I feel that, of course, the human capacities which are still undeveloped, our latent capacities within us, is not so much a physical development. I don't feel that the human body is going to naturally evolve any further. We're not going to grow a third arm or a third leg or another pair of eyes. The next stage of development are internal faculties, faculties which we may call psychic faculties. And those are the faculties which can pierce beyond the veil, outside of the containment. So it's not about rising up with a club or a gun and revolting against the physical system that keeps you in the physical realm. I feel now that the next way, and the way in time that human being will be able to move out of this containment system, will be on a non-physical level by faculties which we are not fully utilizing yet. So the way out may be through the indoor. Just a few thoughts there, and allowed me to share an old essay which I had almost completely forgotten about, actually. Only when looking back through my my archives did I find that, and I found it unnervingly prescient. So it's good to be aware of our physical circumstances as well as our innate human capacities, which may go beyond the ken of the physical realm. So I think I've said enough for now. Thank you for bearing with me. As always, stay well, stay healthy, stay sane, and be grounded. Cheers.